Okay, here is some feedback about assignment 1. First, I checked the selection of the concept. So is the concept really a characteristic of an individual? At least one of you picked a concept which cannot be seen as a characteristic of an individual, for world peace, for example. Now, you could have changed that into perceptions of world peace or the extent to which you like world peace, but given the fact that most people will like world peace, that will not give you a lot of variation. Another example was a student who studied terrorism, conceptualized the word terrorism, but that is clearly not a characteristic of an individual. Fortunately, that student then changed its topic somewhat halfway the assignment into the fear for terrorism, but still, then you should conceptualize fear for terrorism instead of terrorism itself. Okay, secondly, is it one characteristic of an individual? I asked you to construct a single scale, meaning that if you include a word or a concept like personality, which is actually just a bunch of variables, then you end up having a very sketchy operationalization, which will never give you one single variable. So keep in mind that I asked you to conceptualize one single aspect of or one single characteristic of an individual, and you should not have selected concepts like personality. A third characteristic I took into account, or a third criterion, is it connected to the literature? It's always good in science if you connect your ideas to what others have written. So if you start with someone who wrote an article about a concept and you deviate slightly from it, you improve it, that was seen as very positive. Is it original? Which is a bit different. I mean, connected to the literature means that you are not very original, but if you connect it to the literature and it's so terribly obvious that you just repeat what is in the literature, then it's not seen as very original. But still, I think I value connectedness to the literature more than originality for sheer originality. A second general criterion was the conceptualization itself. Are facets distinguished or not? I mean, some were very vague, and I could only find the facets by closely reading the text. But if you would have added a graph outlining the main facets, that would have helped me grading the assignment. Secondly, some of you, or many of you, just selected a bunch of facets. So, for example, there was one student who included both general job satisfaction and satisfaction with pay. Now, these facets are overlapping. That doesn't give you a very clear conceptualization. Always try to have facets that are not overlapping. And in addition, the facets should be somehow complete, not a random selection of things that are important, but aim for something which is showing the most important points and make clear that these are the most important points. The relationship between the facets and the terms should be made clear. It's and with an A and not with an E. At least two of you made that mistake, and they seem to have missed the point then, because and means plus, and end with an E is the end of it. So the relationship between facets and terms should have been made clear and explicit, and that was quite frequently missing in the assignments. The third one was the items. I checked whether the items were somehow related to the facets. Now, this is something you should keep in mind, that when you are creating a questionnaire, you do not normally do that. I trained you to do that, I have to admit, and I also paid some attention to that. But normally, you do not want to have the facets covered by one single item. So I stimulated you that for didactical purposes, but this has some drawbacks. Because if you have conceptualized your concept with, say, 3 different facets that are not overlapping, are very different from each other, then the items do not measure the same thing. Okay? The whole idea of having 3 or 4 items in a measurement is that you measure the same thing 3 times in order to check reliability. Okay, Grambus alpha, you all know that. But if facets are really different, like for example in the bachelor concept, age, gender and marital status. These things are not correlated at all. So you cannot simply equate the idea of facets with the idea of creating items. You have to think about facets in a term because you have to make sure that you understand what the concept means, but the items themselves should cover as many facets as possible in order to have them measuring the same thing. So keep that in mind, that I trained you to do this, and I didn't subtract points if you clearly connected your items to your facets, but normally we want to have items covering several facets instead of just one. I also checked whether the items were relevant for the concept itself. So for example, if you are interested in attitudes toward terrorism, so you think you want to check what people think of terrorism, then including a question like, do you like your country, does not contribute much to the idea of terrorism. Many people do not like their country, but are very much opposed to terrorism. Okay. Did the survey items meet the criteria for good survey items? That is, of course, something I generally checked. Still, people had double-barreled questions, vague questions, double negations, which is not an explicit criterion, but makes the question very difficult to read. So, are you in favor of not having this? I don't understand that, or at least I have to read a question like that 3 or 4 times before I give the correct answer. Did you explain the idea that it was a scale? So, for example, did you explain how the items should be added? Were they, for example, equally important, or were they just added up, or should they be taken as necessary and sufficient conditions in order to create a dichotomy? That was not made clear, at least not by some. It was not made clear by some. So was explained how the items were to be merged into measuring one single concept. That was a criterion I also took into account when grading. Now finally, the layout aspects. Please give me good, clearly layouted assignments. References according, so no spelling errors in your assignment, references according to the APA style, page numbers. More than half of you did not include page numbers. It's a 6-page assignment, so include page numbers, and section headers, which makes it much better readable. Okay, that was it. That was the feedback for assignment 1. If you want to have personalized feedback, I've got a lot of that, then you can drop by. If you think, well, I think I've learned sufficiently well how to create a scale and how to come up with a clear conceptualization, then you don't need an assignment. You got your grade now. Okay, thank you very much.